Florida State Prison. August 19, 2025. Inside the death chamber sits a 67-year-old U.S. veteran. For more than 4 decades, he's waited for this moment. How did a former soldier, a man who once wore the uniform of his country, end up here, condemned for one of Florida's most brutal crimes of the 1980s? His name is Kayle Barrington Bates. His crime shocked Bay County, Florida in 1982, and his execution ignited a firestorm over veterans, mental health, and the death penalty itself. Tonight, we'll walk you through the full story, the crime that ended a young woman's life, the swift arrest and trial, the decades of appeals tied to his military service, and finally, his last meal, his final words, and the silence that followed. Her name was Janet Renee White. She was just 24 years old in the summer of 1982, a young woman building her life in Bay County, Florida. Janet worked at a small insurance office where co-workers described her as warm, dependable, and full of ambition. But Janet wasn't just an office worker. She was a wife and a mother. At home was her husband, Randy White, who adored her, and their 3-year-old daughter, Jessica. Family friends said Janet's world revolved around the little girl she called her sunshine. On June 14, 1982, Janet left home like she always did, kissed her daughter goodbye, promised Randy she'd be back for dinner, and headed to the office. Nothing about that Monday morning suggested it would be her last. That afternoon, she placed a routine phone call from her office, leaving behind what would unknowingly become her final words to the outside world. Minutes later, Janet was gone. When she didn't return home that evening, Randy knew something was wrong. Calls went unanswered. Police were alerted. By nightfall, fear had settled over the White household. Randy was suddenly a husband without his wife. Janet wasn't just another victim on a police report. She was a wife, a mother, a daughter, and the brutal way her life was taken would tear a hole in her family that not even 4 decades could heal. It was late in the afternoon on June 14, 1982. Janet had just wrapped up a phone call at her Bay County insurance office. To her co-workers, it seemed like an ordinary day. But outside, danger was already circling. Waiting nearby was Kayle Barrington Bates. At 24, he was a U.S. veteran who had drifted into a life of instability and violence. That day, his sights were set on Janet. Bates entered the office, forced Janet from her desk, and dragged her into his vehicle. Witnesses would later recall seeing a man matching his description speeding away, Janet in the passenger seat, visibly terrified. He drove her into the woods outside of town, a stretch of isolated land where help was miles away. There, the attack turned brutal. Prosecutors later described how Bates attempted to sexually assault her, then stabbed her multiple times. He ripped a diamond ring from her finger, a gift from her husband, Randy, before leaving her body in the underbrush. By the time police began their frantic search, Janet's life had already been cut short. What made the crime even more chilling was how quickly the net closed around Bates. Deputies found him not far from the scene. He was muddy, blood-stained, and carrying Janet's ring in his pocket. His clothes told the story before he even spoke. And in that moment, investigators knew they had their man. Bates was arrested on the spot. At the sheriff's office, investigators pieced together the timeline: the abduction from the insurance office, the drive to the woods, the attempted sexual assault, the stabbing, and the robbery. Every thread pointed back to him. By the time his trial began in 1983, prosecutors had built an airtight case. They didn't just have physical evidence. They had witnesses who placed him near the office, forensic analysis linking him to the crime scene, and the stolen ring that sealed his guilt. In the courtroom, jurors heard the brutal details of Janet's last moments. They saw photos of the crime scene. They listened to investigators describe how her life had been taken in fear and violence. The defense had little to work with. They pointed to his military service, his troubled past, even suggested he wasn't in his right mind. But nothing could outweigh the brutality of the crime. When the jury returned, the verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and attempted sexual battery. The sentence: death by lethal injection. For Randy White, sitting in the courtroom, the words brought some relief, but no healing. His wife was gone. And now, the man who destroyed his family was headed to Florida's death row. What followed wasn't just years, but decades of appeals, delays, and legal maneuvering. In all, Bates spent more than 42 years waiting for his sentence to be carried out. His lawyers fought tirelessly, raising every argument they could to spare his life. They claimed constitutional violations, pointing out that his jury had been all white. They pushed for DNA testing, arguing that the forensic evidence from 1982 should be re-examined with modern science. They questioned whether the trial had been fair, given the speed of the proceedings and the racial makeup of the jury. But one of the most powerful arguments his defense leaned on was Bates's military service. Before the crime, he had served in the U.S. National Guard. His attorneys said he suffered from a mild traumatic brain injury and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, the lingering effects of his time in uniform. They insisted that Bates's service and possible mental health struggles should weigh against his execution. The pleas gained traction outside the courtroom. By the 2020s, more than 130 military veterans and advocacy groups signed letters urging Florida's governor to grant clemency. They argued that executing a veteran with brain trauma and PTSD sent the wrong message, that a man who once served his country could be discarded by it. But for Janet White's family, and for Florida prosecutors, the focus was always the same: the brutal murder of a 24-year-old woman, ripped away from her husband and daughter. To them, no amount of military service or courtroom debate could erase the horror of that crime. Appeal after appeal was denied. The Florida Supreme Court upheld his conviction. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. And when clemency finally came before the governor, it was denied. By mid-2025, after more than 4 decades of legal battles, the state set a date: August 19, 2025. The execution of Kayle Barrington Bates would go forward. By the summer of 2025, Florida had already executed more prisoners than any other state that year. Yet one case stood out above the rest: the scheduled execution of Kayle Barrington Bates, now 67 years old, a U.S. veteran who had spent over 42 years on death row. Outside the prison, protesters gathered in the sweltering August heat. On one side were anti-death penalty activists, holding signs that read, "Mercy for veterans," and "Justice, not death." On the other were supporters of Janet White's family, demanding closure for a crime that had haunted them since 1982. Inside the walls of Florida State Prison, Bates's final hours were set into motion. Prison officials offered him the traditional right to a last meal. He declined. The menu would be ordinary, nothing special. But for Janet's husband, Randy White, this day was far from ordinary. He had been just 26 years old when his wife was murdered, left to raise their daughter Jessica alone. And now, in 2025, he was determined to keep the promise he made years earlier: he would be there at the very end. Randy sat among the witnesses, staring through the glass at the man who had destroyed his family. "I made a promise to my wife," he told reporters earlier that day. "I've waited over 40 years for this. Justice has finally come." For Bates's supporters, however, the mood was different. They believed Florida was about to execute not just a killer, but a veteran who had served his country and lived with brain trauma. They said his death proved the system was unforgiving, blind to rehabilitation or mercy. As the clock ticked toward 6 p.m., tension built both inside and outside the prison walls. For Randy, the wait had been excruciatingly long. For Bates, the wait was nearly over. As the tradition of death row allows, Kayle Barrington Bates was offered the chance to request a special final meal. Many inmates seized the moment: steaks, fried chicken, pizza, ice cream. But Bates declined. He would eat nothing beyond what was already served from the prison kitchen that evening. No indulgence. No requests. Just silence. Shortly after 6 p.m., Bates was escorted into the death chamber at Florida State Prison. The fluorescent lights glared down. He was strapped onto the gurney, 4 lines taped to his arms. Behind the glass stood witnesses, officials, journalists, activists, and most importantly, Randy White, the widower who had waited more than 40 years for this night. The warden leaned forward and asked the traditional question: "Do you have any last words?" Bates turned his head slightly, his face calm. His answer was one word: no. No apology. No explanation. No prayer. At 6:17 p.m., the lethal injection flowed into his veins. Within minutes, his breathing slowed. His chest stopped rising. and at 6:24 p.m., he was pronounced dead. The veteran who once wore his country's uniform, the convicted murderer who tore a young wife and mother from her family, was gone. As the clock struck 6:24 p.m., the announcement was made, time of death. For Randy, it was closure, not healing, but a long-delayed fulfillment of a vow. Outside the prison, reactions were far from unified. On one side, supporters of Janet's family cheered the execution, saying the system had worked, even if it had taken too long. To them, Bates's silence in his final moments was just another insult, a man unrepentant until the very end. But on the other side, protesters wept and shouted. Veteran groups held signs that read, "Don't execute those who served." They insisted Bates's military background, his reported brain trauma, and decades of confinement should have been enough to spare his life. To them, his execution symbolized a justice system unwilling to show mercy. His execution was the 10th carried out in the state in 2025 alone, more than in any other state, more than in any year since capital punishment returned in the 1970s. For prosecutors and supporters of the death penalty, Bates's case was proof that no matter how long it takes, justice will not be denied. For Randy White and his daughter Jessica, Janet's absence remained the painful constant. Justice had come, but it could never bring her back. A husband was still a widower. And for the nation, the case of Kayle Barrington Bates left behind a haunting paradox. Can decades of time, service to one's country, or even claims of trauma soften the weight of a crime so brutal? Or is justice, even when delayed 42 years, the only true answer? So the question lingers. Was this justice, or was it vengeance, delivered too late? What do you think? Should Bates's military service and trauma have spared his life, or was the state right to finally fulfill the promise of justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective. And if this case gripped you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story.